Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to episode 35 of Quarantime. It has now been over 4 months since Drew Youngs wrote those introductory lyrics for us that warn us that we're going to have to get together by staying at home and other silly stuff in theme music. Drew, I don't think anybody realized we'd be playing this thing for 4 months. If you've been following Quarantine, you may have, for the couple of years, we look at how the world of art and culture are both responding to this COVID moment in terms of what artists have to say and help us interpret it, but also how these media are realigning themselves at a time when we're not going to museums and our homes are being this or our homes are where stuff streams into. And boy, we have an exciting show today on that front with some of the most interesting artists in the world, and Steve Sachs, who is a gallerist who has been curating emerging and new media art for a while. So let me join, or have us join, Mickey McManus, our co-host for today's show. Hey, Mick. I would like to point out, when we last saw you.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. You were in your Airstream because you had brought your hermetically sealed
somewhere
with you
in the Redwoods.
The Redwoods.
Yeah.
A living example that these days we bring home with us and surround ourselves with a bubble. So welcome home. Back to your other bubble.
Yeah, I'm excited. Yeah,
so
a different bubble.
A little bit about today. We're going to start by meeting our friend Steve Sachs, who runs the BITFORMS rate. Around the year 2000, emerging media arts. So think of that as art that where artists express themselves in code, screen spots, that whole arena. And by the way, Omid is telling me that my internet is choppy. So what I may do is check the router and just turn it over to you, Mick, for a little bit of a stop. I do a technical. So over to you for a second while I do a technical.
Yeah. Sounds good. So yeah, we're pretty excited. Today we have a few guests, and I think Steve will be our first one up. And Rafael as well. We'll bring them. Steve is with Form Gallery in New York, one of the really first or early galleries that really drove deep into digital and data and new forms of art, what the new mediums might be and how we might interact with them. And so Steve will join us. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer will join us. And then we'll have a segment that we recorded with two of my very good friends, Renata and Paul, in the UK. They'll talk a little bit about it's like as an artist to grapple with COVID or grapple with these times, I guess, and how to look differently. I think for all of us at a way to think like an artist in some ways, and how to take that. That perspective and bring it to your own life and trying to connect.
Hey, Mick,
so that's kind of how it goes. Peter, how?
Yeah. So just so the audience knows what happened there. First of all, when we put this show together, we realized with everybody at home, it was just a lot easier for the internet to fail. That's why there's two hosts and two people running the show. And indeed, what I did is I booted up to my Comcast network, which is no good. And I just switched over to Monkey Brains, which is a really good ISP in San Francisco. So that's why it works now. And
it's a weird, like, microwave
what I was mentioning just before that
kind of ISP.
Around the year 2000, the Whitney Museum in New York had a show called Bitstreams. And here at the Museum of Modern Art, we had 010101. These were some of the first shows that showed how artists that worked in technology were responding to things like privacy, the ubiquity of new and emerging technology. And Steve started what's probably the most foremost gallery in the nation to look at those issues and curate and cultivate those artists. So Steve's about to join us, and Rafael Lozano-Hemmer is.
Why don't we have Steve join, and why don't we have Rafael just join
Let's
on
bring
our
everybody
screen
up. Come
and
on,
at
guys.
least say
Hi.
hi.
Hello,
and
everybody.
yeah, bring everybody up.
Hello.
Hi. Well,
Cheers.
Cheers. Steve, you're in New York City.
Yep, I am.
And Rafael, you are in Montreal, where
That's
I understand you have configured a socially distanced exhibition after the Museum of Modern Art was about to open a major show of yours here, and then that got canceled or postponed. And so we'd love to hear from you, both the work you're up to and how you're adapting in all of this. And we'll come back to you I guess we'll come back to you in a moment in detail and all of that, but this is going to be fun. Steve, you and I met around the year 2000, I was mentioning. You and I actually met at the Guggenheim when you were just beginning to kind of look at this whole field. Media-based art, I think, originally wasn't taken as seriously. Now it's a big part of the landscape, and it both uses new media and comments on it. What's been a little bit of the arc of what you've seen in these, 20 years now?
Gosh, 20 years. Well, there's different ways of answering that question. I mean, I'm as a gallerist, also as someone who's looking at it culturally, creatively. I think artistically, it's definitely been something that has been much more embraced over time. I think this kind of pre and post internet generation definitely had an impact on the acceptance and understanding of media art. And, you know, over the years, I think that museums started to engage more. And as the museums started to engage more, as you were mentioning, my inspiration actually was these few shows that you had described, the Bitstream show and the 010101 show in San Francisco, you know, gave me that the impetus to actually go out there and create something that would educate an audience in the fine art world about the possibilities of collecting this kind of work. So as the years went on, more museums were embracing it, showing it, and that basically trickled down to collectors and general society having more interest, asking more questions, and also the work generally actually getting better, both conceptually, both you know, even in how the work is produced. The quality of production increased dramatically.
Why don't we do this? We're going to go to we're going to take a deep dive with Rafael, but let's take a look at some of the work that you've had up over the years that that I've gotten to know pretty well. Maybe we could start with a work by Casey Reese here. Omid, can we pop up signal to noise?
Yeah.
Casey was the co-creator of an open source a language called processing that a lot of artists use. And in this piece here, it's as it runs, it's a little choppy over the internet, but basically in the background is a piece of analog video, and in the foreground, it's a digital response to that, right? So he's taken the old analog world and the new digital world, and they're kind of having a dialogue or fighting each other here.
Yeah, I think what's really important here is a phrase that is used by a lot of the artists that I work with, which is generative art. So this became something a little more prevalent as the years went on, where artists were actually using software to create their work. And in this case, it's also a commentary on this transition from analog to digital. So he was basically studying television signals and using those signals and then creating abstract forms based on that feed in real time. So basically what you're seeing, this is a video excerpt, but the actual work itself that's collected is a never-ending interpretation of that analog imagery.
That's right. When we say generative, what we mean is it's not a static picture, it's not a JPEG, it's not a movie. There's a computer rendering it in real time, and because often cases there's random things in there, you never get the same thing twice. By the way, I have this work. It runs on a Mac Mini in my house, and it startles many people. Let's talk about Daniel Kanagar.
Yeah.
Daniel has done stuff at great scale. I've seen work of his that has taken over signs in Times Square, and he's done fascinating stuff with kind of leading edge, flexible, fluid displays.
Yeah. So this is actually my current show.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm saying this is I'm glad you're showing it, because it's the current show we have here in New York. And again, this is a good story, because literally the week of the installation, which I can't even remember now, I guess it was in March, the COVID was kicking in New York, and they had to actually, the artist and his technician had to leave mid-installation because they were cutting off air travel to Europe. So this show has been up since mid-March, which is the longest show I've ever had here in the gallery in 20 years. I think it's been over around 4 months now. And so it was a really challenging beginning, but basically this body of work he's been working on for a few years, which is unusual in that it's merging the concept of sculpture and video. And generative, actually, what you just mentioned. So the content that you're seeing abstractly move on the screen are connected to real-time Google Trends. So the trends appear over time. Every 10 minutes, a new trend set appears. And then that trend is interpreted using color and movement.
And there was one that you had actually in a San Francisco show that was based on seismic data, right? It was. And do we have a movie of this, Omid? Is there a video version of any of these?
I don't know if I have the site. Well, this one's moving.
Yeah, so this just gives you a sense. And what's interesting is he's these kinds of displays that can paint on anything and curve on anything may become incredibly common building material, which suggests that the distinction between this is a piece of art in a frame and this is my wall, at some point, everything might be emissive, at which point, today we have like a painter paint white on the wall and then there's art, but actually that would not have to be.
Well, yeah. Well, I think the biggest kind of evolution in this thinking was before this happened, the screen was a very rigid substrate. You had to deal with certain ratios and constraints of the form. And this really was the first time, other than projection mapping onto an object, that you could start to play with sculpture and video as one object, which was pretty exciting. And as you said, it could be scaled to huge areas.
And with a nod to what might be a screen. Just behind you.
Wait,
Steve.
I have a one comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, well, just one other comment. The same technology that allows you to put basically organic emission elements, down at the pixel level on these curved surfaces. There's been some recent research in putting a camera at each pixel. Now, what's interesting about that is that much like a fly, has a compound lens for its eye. That means instead of me always looking like I'm not looking at you, I'm like looking down from the camera or looking up at the camera. Every surface sees at infinite resolution. And so there's some really interesting stuff going on now with sort of algorithmic and silicon cameras that are just a part of the surface too. So your table just sees all of the things. And a lot of people don't realize that, like, their mouse used to be a ball at the bottom of the mouse, but now it's just a camera looking at the patterns of your table and then reflecting back. And so it's this, each step is actually starting to bring almost one more dimension to expressiveness, I think. Now we can put it on surfaces, emit, but we can also start using them to see things and maybe let us see things we haven't been able to see before.
To show the incredible dynamic range of what a display might be. We talk about all these high-tech things, but just behind your arm, Steve, is something that looks like a wooden sculpture. Yeah. Only it's not a wooden sculpture, it's a wooden display, a wooden version of mirror. Yeah. And this is by Danny Rosen.
Oh, so yeah, the wooden mirror.
Take a look at Danny's wooden mirror. And so when was this piece first done, Steve?
The original one gosh, 1999.
Okay, so this was amazing, right? The world is just like, it's the era of AOL and the internet. The internet is just blasting through. We're in the bubble. Everybody has screens, and there's a little camera behind that, and each of those squares is actually a polished piece of wood on a stepper motor that flips. So if you look at the video of it, as a person walks by, the wood itself moves. And he has executed this kind of thing both as a mirror with wood. He also did one with trash, where all sorts of, like Snickers bars and popsicle sticks and toothpaste become the whole thing. And what's interesting about this video is people are kind of astounded both as they look at it, and now we'll see what that looks like.
Yeah, this was an art fair. This was actually, I'm glad you're showing that, because that was the original form that he created, the hexagon.
Yeah,
and
I remember that from Seagraph years ago when he was first doing the experimentation. What I think is interesting about this is the susurration, that it had a sound to it, because it was actually little pieces of wood flipping. There was a little,
and that was amazing.
So it was almost like photons becoming tangible. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a part of the work, and all of that he controls, and here you can hear this one, but you can see the level of clarity is pretty extraordinary. I mean, basically, they're physical pixels that are dealing with gradations of light to dark. But he really, the creation of this physical, interpretation of the pixel was quite original at the time.
It was mind-blowing at the time, yeah.
And it still is, really. It's still quite popular.
No, and the fact that
well, it's this notion that it's robotic down at the pixel level. So it's, it's little micro movements across the whole thing, which is, of course, what we see when we see leaves blowing in the wind in the forest. But we're not used to seeing mechanistic versions of that, that richness.
The other thing, an artwork, if you think about, when I'm selling works that are on the screen, when you turn the screen off, it's basically a blank screen. It's a black void. This has two interpretations. It has a physical presence as a sculpture, and then of course this magic happens when it's on. But that became something very intriguing for me, and Raphael has done a lot of that, where this combination of the physical and the generative and the computational, where they have two different states of being.
Why don't we do this? We've got a few more of your artists, but let's bring Raphael in and take a look at his work story and what you're doing now, and then maybe we'll all talk about some of the more political works at the end of all this. Hey, Raphael, you and I first met when you were doing a magnificent immersive piece in the Park Avenue Tunnel in New York.
Right. Yeah, that was 2013, perhaps. I think so. Park Avenue Tunnel, Voice Tunnel, it was called.
And I mean, the hallmark of so much of your work, and I'd love you to tell us your story, is you do things that are really immersive. Like you took over this, was basically like a subway tunnel, but the cars go through it for about 7 blocks. Humans never go in there. And you turned it into a space where people were connected, their voices drove the lights, and you created a phantasmagoria in a sacred space that you never go to otherwise. And that's a lot of what you're up to now in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to have art infect infrastructure and to recreate the notions of what being public is all about. I think that we create art, but we also create publics. And that's an interesting sort of dynamic and relationship. I have some examples of some of my work. I'll press share screen, and that way you guys can see what I can see. Can you please let me know when you can see my screen?
Got it.
My screen at the time? Excellent. Yeah. So just real quick, is I have a team of 15, 16 people in Montreal, Canada. I'm originally from Mexico, but we're a team from 7 countries. Half of us are engineers, or I'm a scientist, I'm a chemist. And then the other half are artists or designers or architects. I'll start by showing this crazy piece that was going to be shown at my show at SFMOMA in Unstable Presence. It's called Vicious Circular Breathing, and it's a hermetically sealed chamber where you're invited to go in and breathe the air that has been breathed by everybody before you. So there is a decompression chamber, the clean air that walks in with you, leaves through 2 valves, and then you're let into a room where you're breathing the recycled air, sharing viruses, bacteria, and pheromones with everybody who was there before you. There's massive warnings on the walls against asphyxiation because there's only 10 days of oxygen, against contagion because there are no filters, and against panic because in order to get out of the chamber, you need to go through the decompression chamber again. The purpose of this piece is to put together all of this communal breath and pipe it through a system of bellows and valves that make 61 brown paper bags inflate and deflate around 10 to 12,000 times a day, which is the normal respiratory frequency for an adult at rest. So the project is this kind of micro version of, our biosphere, if you will. Oftentimes, people like myself talk about participation and interaction as a very positive thing, as giving you agency or personalizing a particular piece. In this piece, if you participate too long, you die. So it's a little bit of a perversion on the concept of participation. If you're in the station inside of it, you're making the air more toxic for future participants. So your relationship to the ecology of this work remains over time. When I first made it, I thought no one would go in, but in fact, there's been lineups and lineups to get into the piece when we showed it in Istanbul, in Montreal, in Mexico, and so on. As you can imagine, we are not going to show
Rafael, were there
COVID. Yes,
not for a while. Were there any sort of creative hacks that people did that you noticed? Huffing a whole bunch of something before going in, or doing like what did you see happen in terms of the ways that people, like maybe repeat visitors or other people, might have done things, or did you? I'm just curious about.
Yeah, it was just
such a provocation.
It was kind of like a lot of people were kind of like disappointed that it wasn't stinkier, for example. I was in it, but I was the first person in it, so only when it was completely clean. I'm completely disgusted by this artwork. Steve, my gallerist, gets mortified when I call my work disgusting, but it's really a reflection, about how we are right now. Buckminster Fuller called us Spaceship Earth. I think of the Earth as, remember that movie, The Bubble Boy, with immune deficiency? We are the bubble boy. There's 7.7 billion people right now. 7.7 billion people right now making toxic the air, the very air that we breathe. So it's a reflection on the commons, on the earth, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, and a materialization of that kind of use. But people were going into it. It was gross. I've done a lot of works that are kind of atmospheric and have to do this idea that the atmosphere is not neutral, that it's active. Currently, COVID teaches us that in globalization, the atmosphere is trying to kill us. So we must think about the biosphere as this entity that, on the one hand, gives us life and allows us to express our song and our poetry and our talk, but it's also something that, in the case of COVID, or in the case of carbon dioxide concentration, for example, is literally trying to kill us. It's kind of like a remedial, sort of response from nature. So in this particular fountain, was also going to be in the SFMOMA show, we are drawing poetry with cold water vapor using ultrasonic atomization. So as you watch the water watches you, it knows you're there, and it starts giving you poetry from Mexican poet Octavio Paz, who talked about the moment where poetry is recited and it becomes the atmosphere, and then you yourself breathe the poem into your private lungs. So there is a lot of I guess, ephemeral attraction in this kind of, sort of water phenomenon. And we've done that.
What's the mechanism that prints the words on the water?
It's called ultrasonic atomization, and it's with the type of technology that you find in aromatherapy devices, for example. Except this is a massive array that we then computerize. And you're seeing here a piece with words, but of course we've done it also with imagery. So this is a project where people's faces get rendered in a basin, a cylindrical basin of water. So there's a phenomenon in our brain called pareidolia, which is the capacity for us to see faces in clouds or in burnt toast or in cats' anuses. We're using this idea in this piece by just doing face detection and then doing levels of posterization to recreate, but for a very brief instant, just after the actuation, there, now. That's a brief moment where you could see yourself, and then you disappear. And then there's a little display that shows you the past 9 participants. This project is currently on view in my massive exhibition in Montreal at the Arsenal Contemporary. So as part of COVID, we had to postpone the SFMOMA show, so that's not going to happen until 2021. But a collector of mine that I have here in Montreal invited me to do a residency in this massive 20,000 square foot space. And so we're showing a lot of different pieces, thinking about how to bring people together at a time of social distancing. So this is one of the world premieres that we have in that show. It's called Encode Decode, and it's basically a 90-foot long projection featuring hundreds of thousands of letters derived from the writing of philosopher Stuart Hall, Jamaican-British philosopher, who basically in the 1970s described at length fake news. So we create this kind of cloud-like fluid environment of describing the mechanisms of fake news and the encoding and decoding of information. And of course, the system reacts to your presence. So depending on where you move, the letters will flow toward your direction. And then there's also this magnetic kind of system that is taking the chaotic letters and forming each and every one of the lines by Stuart Hall and writing them like citations that you can read the entire text from. The interest in working with Stuart Hall is not just about the fake news, obviously, but it's also about how to be in dialogue with Black Lives Matter. So as a senior important thinker of post-colonialism and of different kinds of violence against minorities, this piece, if it gets acquired, we're working with his widow. We've asked her if she'd like us to donate partly to his foundation, and she said that wasn't necessary. We're just going to give the money to Black Lives Matter in general. So these kinds of works exist in this massive immersive versions, but they also exist in smaller editions. Basically, I think of these as treatments. It's a little bit of what Peter was talking about, like when everything becomes a surface. And what is the art? Well, the artwork is a treatment. It's not unlike wallpaper. It's not unlike a viral contagion for your building. So as an example of that, let me just show you this. This is an artwork.
Well, this also, Rafael, it seems like it goes back to your point about that art infects infrastructure. And I think that that's a wonderful kind of example of that. I'm just trying to draw connections to what you said at the beginning, too.
For sure.
And what's going on here?
This is the collected works of Raimundo Lulio. Lulio was a 13th century Spanish Catalan philosopher who invented concentric circle calculators. So he basically took these concentric circles and he tried to calculate divinity with them. But Leibniz and then later Charles Babbage were inspired by the concentric circle calculators of Raimundo Lulio to generate the very first mechanical calculators, the difference engine and then the analytical engine. So what we do is we take the entirety of Lulio's writing, it's in Latin and Catalan, and we create this concentric circle wheels that he describes in the very text. And in this case, they're presented in a triptych that can be acquired in an edition. Speaks to Steve about that. This is a weird work. This is 3,000 loudspeakers, each of which has a different sound channel playing out. So there are 3,000 field recordings. And as you walk down this tunnel, it's 36 meters long by 3.5 wide, you hear this kinds of waves of sound, which go from like 200 birds from the Cornell Ornithology Library to 200 insects. We have sounds of air and wind and water, but it also has human sounds and bells and metronomes and so on. So one of the things that we're very interested in at the studio is how can you make these artworks where you have a screen but of speakers, not a screen of pixels. Obviously, there is the animation of the actual loudspeaker has LEDs, but we're curious about, you know, a pixel is nothing more than a flashing light. But when it's together with other neighbors, it forms something that is a picture. The question is, if you have thousands of different sounds of channel playing back simultaneously, is something more polyphonic or more interesting or more complex generated? And the answer is a resounding yes. So this show, this piece that we're seeing it now here in Montreal, this is footage from today. My show in Montreal just opened today. I cannot express how shitty video is to you know, sort of capture the experience of it, because even if two people are 1 meter or 2 meters away.
But if you're in,
if
you're in Montreal, could you go and sign up?
Yeah. It's a show
or tomorrow or this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a show.
It's very. I mean, it's obviously limited. I love it. Yeah. And we're putting up the address. You know, so what you're saying, Rafael, though, is really intriguing. If you look at information visualization research back in the early days, one of the things that they found was that when you render something visually or in a sequence motion, and you also listen to that same sequence of data, so not of a physical thing, but of data, because we have two different kinds of signal processing things, the ears and the brain, people are able to detect anomalies in the signal if it's played both audio and visual, but you cannot hear it in audio alone or visual alone. And so there's a sort of polymorphic rendering that goes on when it's in multiple dimensions. And our brains are, there's a very famous theory called the Mr. Potato Head theory of the brain, where if you put a nose here and you start putting, you know, smelly senses in, your brain will figure it out if it can correlate with other things and make associations. So if it's David Eagleman has popularized that theory, and he's been able to prove that you pretty much can have an API for new senses fairly trivially. I think they've actually just released the API for some tools like that. So this is sort of exciting because you're experimenting live with that, and in a deeply immersive way. That's what I'm excited about.
Rafael, the experience
you're in the art.
As you're going through this, pixels, look, each pixel corresponds to a larger image. Here, you probably have to use very directional speakers so that no matter where you are, you actually get a different experience as you move.
Yeah, but they're not that directional. So you do get contamination, but that's part of the beauty of it, right? So the greatest composer of our time is perhaps, or of all time, is Johann Sebastian Bach. And it's all about this idea of counterpoint, of the overlap of melodies. So something happens when you have this capacity to multiplex sound in this massive arrays, this pixelization. I don't know if you guys are seeing what I'm showing now. Do you guys see what I'm showing?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So again, this desire, like in Danny Rosen, to convert inanimate things like loudspeakers into pixels. In this case, we're again doing the atomization, but this time in a piece called Cloud Display, which is voice recognition. So it has a very robust voice recognition system, and anything that you tell the fountain basically gets written up. And there's no censorship. So we showed this project in Manchester last year, and everybody is like, fuck Trump and Brexit sucks and stuff like that. It's beautiful to see voice recognition create this kind of ephemeral presentation in midair. The project at the end of each presentation becomes like a waterfall, and you know, thousands or hundreds of people start playing with the water. I'm very interested in making
beautiful.
the atmosphere tangible and make it into something that's not neutral. I'm very inspired by the work of Charles Babbage in 1837. He said that when we speak, we create a turbulence. And if we could have a computer that was so sophisticated that we could rewind the turbulence, we could recreate the voices of everybody who has spoken in the past. And so if you actually think about it, for him, the atmosphere was a vast library that contained everybody's voices from the past, and you could listen to long lost loved ones. Or, for example, in a beautiful passage, he talks about how slave owners are getting away with murder, but that all their deeds are being recorded by the atmosphere. And one day we will decipher the turbulence of the air and be able to recreate those voices and send them back to trial. So these projects, they're all about, this is Brian Eno saying tax evasion. All of these projects are about how do we make visible our voice? How do we make visible the atmosphere?
Your the title of your
and it feels like a lot of what you're doing. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just to say that the title of the show that you were doing at the Museum of Modern Art, Unstable Presence, was really a nod to complexity science, right? And to the notion that that there are all of these initial conditions that are created that are not predictable to create unstable things, and then there's this whole math around understanding that, and you're really applying that to the art world, using those very same themes to both let us viscerally understand it and play with those things, and which is incredibly timely.
And I think when I'm pretentious, I say that that's like Brunelleschi with perspective, right? Like, because Brunelleschi came along and then all of a sudden mapped Euclidean space, and you now had like a different way to represent. I think that nonlinear mathematics and cellular automata and fractals and all of the different recursive algorithms are the math of our time, and the work of art is going to reflect those nonlinear mathematics. So I'm super interested in that side of development, of emergent development in the arts.
In the statement around the MoMA
Hey, Rafael,
show,
before you move on from oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter. I want to get a question in here.
On that. The statement on your MoMA show, it talked about unstable physical systems, which could be clouds and water and stuff like that. But you also talked about unstable human systems, and I'm wondering if that refers to like either social media or mobs or behavior.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. I mean, we are right now the subject of a really unstable set of rulers, right? And these set of rulers are turbulent, and it's very difficult to ascertain what is behind this turbulence. Actually, it's not difficult. We kind of know what they are. They're just mob adjacent. But the idea that fake news, for example, or manipulation of electoral systems, or different ways in which the technologies of control are actually submitting us or subjecting us to a certain kind of new regime, which is not yet completely Orwellian, but the potential sure is there, is a massive concern for me. Instability in that sense is something that allows also to think about the interruption of said systems of control. How can we create democratic potential and zones of a certain autonomy from that kind of controlling system? So instability can be seen as fragility, but it can also be seen as flexibility, the capacity to react against such systems that are adversarial. So I think that instability applies also to our contemporary history. I can't think of a moment as difficult as you guys have right now in the United States. I remember that during the Spanish Civil War, all the intellectuals, Camus and George Sand and Orwell, they all went to Spain because there was this new thing called fascism that was arising. And I have a feeling that we have a similar situation right now. I know that what you guys have is not straight fascism, but I do think that we need to mobilize all of the intellectuals to combat the destruction of democratic institutions, to combat the curtailing of freedom of speech in the way that Trump does on a daily tweet. I promised my wife I'd never talk about Trump in this kind of presentations, but I can't help myself. I think that we genuinely are in a very difficult adversarial moment, and it is up to all of us to intervene. And the footage that you're seeing is people from El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez speaking to each other through these robot lights that create bridges of light between the U.S. and Mexico across the border. What was beautiful, you guys, about this project is that people who, for example, in El Paso had never been to Mexico established friendships. People who have family members and they've been separated, they express themselves. We had flirting, we had serenading, we had poets, feminist rappers were rapping to each other. We had an unbelievable amount of participation on both sides of the border, because these borders are, as we all know, this kind of artificial, adversarial, ineffective way to divide countries and posit the importance of nationalism and control people. But when art can actually establish a bridge of connectivity, it is so beautiful to see the response of people. Throughout the 18 nights of this project called Border Tuner, we saw, for example, like a U.S. veteran of war who fought in Vietnam. He got deported to Mexico because he didn't have papers. I mean, what world do we live in when that happens? We saw, for example, one of the most beautiful scenes was a Mexican wrestler who, you know how Mexican wrestlers have themes? Well, this Mexican wrestler's theme is drag queen. So his name is Casandro el Exótico. And he's like a super wrestler, but he's like fabulous. And he's got lots of makeup and stuff. And he was speaking to a German wrestler and on the other side. And the German wrestler, she said, you know, I'm from Berlin and I'm here to tell you the walls come down. And people just were like clapping, and there was like, you know, just, it was really incredible. And then this is the mayor of El Paso, who's a Republican, and yet he stood up to Trump when Trump came and said, well, now that I've put my wall, El Paso is a lot more safe. The mayor, who's a Republican, said, I'm sorry to contradict you, Mr. President, but El Paso has been the safest city in the United States for the past 30 years. This is not, you know, this wall does not represent us. So I have a lot of admiration for Republicans who are reasonable and who understand in the field what is at stake. So this project had indigenous.
Hey, Rafael, I want to jump in.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I love what's going on here, and I think everyone can find your clips, and we'll post some additional links as well. You know, one of the things you talked about is that you can't not talk about the USA at this moment. Sitting in your Montreal locale, and this obviously highlights it pretty dramatically. You know, just this idea of we're going to build a wall, and the craziness coming out of the conversation. There's a fascinating book, and I don't know if you've read it, but it's called Churchill and Orwell. And it turns out Churchill did not know Orwell, and Orwell did not know Churchill. Although in 1984, the main character's name is Winston. And they were both fighting against a lifelong battle of state-sponsored murder. And it was actually written by a war reporter, a war journalist that had been to Iraq and Afghanistan. And he knew that both Winston and Churchill, Winston in the Spanish Civil War and Churchill in the Boers War, were journalists and reporters originally. And so I want to flag it because I think it's a very beautiful kind of rumination that we keep thinking we're going to get past this, but actually we're proving in America right now that we're right in the middle of exactly that sort of battle. And I do think while America is the kind of canary in the coal mine, I think this is more a matter of we're the easiest to show off with a white hat hacker like Trump, to actually demonstrate the limits of the ways that we structured our society and our markets in the 20th century. I don't think that this is not going to come to Canada or Europe or other places. I just think we're the canary in the coal mine.
I agree.
And that's maybe what worries me the most.
I have a question.
You know, a lot of your stuff seems to be jumping realms. Well, one sec. A lot of your stuff seems to be jumping realms, Raphael.
Yeah.
From the realm of visual to tangible to sound to whatever. But early on in this conversation, you talked about participation and this notion that we sort of infect infrastructure and create culture. Tell me just one more word about sort of what do you think the ultimate outcome of participation is, or how does the art become, disgusting, offensive, have a point of view, etc. Where do you see that going? In other words, how does the participation change things, or what does it do? What do you believe?
Yeah. So to answer your question, there's a massive amount of alienation going around. People are isolated and lonely at record levels. And yes, we're connected to more and more Facebook friends, but at the same time, we're existing in tiny little bubbles, like Sloterdijk calls this kind of foam. So we are part of this global foam, and anything that we can do to interrupt the patterns of discussion outside of our bubbles is a welcome approach, in my opinion, because we have a situation where art is a disruption or an interruption in the ways that we use, for example, public space or the internet. The thing that I most aspire to do is to create a sense of emergent communities that are disparate, where disparate sort of realities can coexist. And of course, in history, we've had examples of that, right? Like translation, like Toledo is a well-known example of the coexistence of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian groups, and a massive period of translation and cross-cultural contamination happened there for the wealth of an intellectual world. So I have a feeling that the best thing that we can hope for is that participation does two things. One is allows to empower the citizen to know that their participation is fundamental to the actual democratic process. So I have zero tolerance for people who don't participate in democratic processes. And I'm not just talking voting, but just being vigilant and militant and being able to not let the system fall to the crooks. So that's one part, participation as a direct thing. And then the second is the idea of relationships. So I think the single thing that art can contribute is establish new relationships between different people. And that's what will create cohesive bonds. I've often advocated for the removal of all cameras, surveillance cameras in public space, and replace them with projectors. So instead of taking images away and assuming suspicion, give us images that we can share and that we can meet others with. And it is my theory, and even though it sounds completely naive, it is my theory that if you were to do that, you would create more safety in your cities, as opposed to pretending that, safeguard.
I love that. Yeah.
I mean, this really does argue for the power of art in the public realm. Mickey, we talked about the urban prototyping projects that we've done in San Francisco, but what you're really saying is, because public stuff can be so engaging and powerful and an antidote to the very private screen worlds we're in, the opportunity and the need for that is like greater than ever. And I have a question on this participation.
Well, and it sounds like what you're saying too, it's creating this kind of safe place for people to bond and to actually, cross borders in their minds and other things. And that's that art becomes a playful, in some ways, way to start to learn about each other, even if we're very different.
Absolutely.
This is also interesting because we're about to reemerge into public space after COVID, and public space will be different for years. We're going to have masks on, we'll be a little bit distanced, right? So the way that an artist might use public space is going to be different because the way people behave will be different. I mean, that creates an interesting field and ground.
But I do believe very much that there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, museums are going to have to close," and all this other stuff. The truth is, I'm a scientist, and I know that vaccination works. My intolerance for anti-vaccination is very high, especially at a time when hundreds of thousands of people are dying. So I know that vaccinations will arrive, treatments and preemptive and education and so on. And what will happen at that time when this happens happens is art will be necessary because we'll need to stage a massive re-embodiment of public space. It will be, it's a super important task, but not just socially, or it's also political. We need to be out in force voting and protesting. We need to occupy our cities. And I have a feeling that after COVID, art can work for mourning on the one hand, but also for continuity, for reestablishing new of these links, because it's becoming easier and easier to control. And what we want to have as a democratic society is for the citizen to be out of control, like art.
At a moment when we've disturbed the norm, right, and we've sent everybody away and we don't know what it means to be public, I think you're right. It could go either way, right? That could be an invitation for control and fascism and letting surveillance cut in, or it could be an assertion of publicness and connectedness, which you know, we're not quite at that moment yet, but you're pointing out is surely it's coming, and surely we have to be proactive about it, which is a very positive charge. I have one question before we go on. Another one of Steve's artists is Sebring Versting, who was just doing a piece around the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that are going on. And maybe if we could just run that, Omid. Many people are, of course, been in these protests nationwide, and many others can't go because they might not go out because they're at an at-risk population. So this is a piece where on your screen you hold, and then Steve, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you basically hold up a protest banner at home, and then it creates an assemblage that is kind of a massive response, but from lots of people at home. So two questions. One, is that what's going on? And then what I'd love to ask everybody is, when we're protesting like this is kind of a fancy version of an internet like I'm in favor of equality. Does this, Rafael, is this participation or is in disruption, or is this like an internet and it's not on the same channel as the civil rights movement where there was a sit-in or you risked something?
Yeah, I don't, in my opinion, this
is this Slack division or is this activism?
No, I think this is activism. I think basically anyone who's using their critical mind and doing something about it, it doesn't matter what it is, you're already being an activist. And I disagree with those people that say, oh, well, if you're just sharing a link on Facebook or signing a petition, you're not doing anything. That's also wrong. These things matter. Everything matters. And I also don't, I'm not moralizing about my stuff is effective or something like that. I don't have a messianic approach to my work. I work as a citizen and I get concerned over the situation, but I try for my works to not be political in the pamphleteering kind of way. I also try not to be opportunistic, right? Oftentimes I work with difficult subjects. Like I did a project a couple of years back about the disappeared students of Ayotzinapa in Mexico. And people were saying, oh, you're just benefiting from the trauma, from the drama of these students having been kidnapped. And it's like, I'm just trying to do something as a citizen. And I think that artists, on the one hand, need to accept the social responsibilities, but on the other, they need to be not messianic. So understand that we're just, trying to put out like proposals, but that those proposals are allowed to contravene.
I like that.
We're about to go on to another
Peter,
segment.
I think, yeah.
But as we wrap up here, and Mick, I'm going to have you introduce our next segment, but Steve, anything else you want to add or perhaps point us to in this world where, because so many of the artists you represent are capable of reaching us virtually because they can come over the internet and appear on screen. So this appears to be kind of an interesting moment for this forum, especially as people are at home and A, they're getting a lot of stuff by streaming, and B, their home becomes their cultural space right now. Yeah.
Well, as you've seen, Sebring, I think, is doing really smart, effective work, which is just getting going now. And many of my artists, obviously, including Rafael, are going to produce online experiences that can have an impact and make a difference, not only in the art world, but in society in general. So, and as you know, Luc Dubois, who you had on the show, I think last time, has done a lot of interesting commentary on voting and democracy in general. So yeah, I think it's absolutely the time for media artists to have more of an impact on these issues.
Rafael, how long does your show go on in Montreal?
It's on until, in the website it says September 26th, but that's just a marketing ploy to say it's going to be extended until the end of October. I'm telling
And
you the truth.
perhaps by then,
get in there.
Americans
If you're
will be
in
allowed to
Montreal,
come visit
go.
Canada.
Yeah, well, this
That's
show, the
wishful
current
thinking,
show,
Peter.
the current exhibition is not really an exhibition. It's like an ongoing workshop. So we have 12 pieces, but we're adding more as time goes by. The next show that I'm having is in the United States at the new Museum of Language in Washington, D.C., which will probably open in September, COVID permitting. And we're making a massive speaking willow tree, which is a tree, like I have an image of it. If you can show the shared screen, I'll just show the picture of it. Can you guys show my shared screen? Whoa, that's beautiful. Oh, that's art. This thing. So this is this is a tree that instead of flowers, it has these cups with LEDs and loudspeakers. And as you walk underneath it, they all light up. Well, they light up, the ones directly over top, and each plays back a different language from the world. So there's 400 languages representing 99% of the world's population. So this tree, if you guys want to see, I just received the very, very first footage of it. You want to see it?
Yeah.
Like a special treat. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Speaking Willow. Boom. I want to show you this video. This is the very, very first video. I just received it today of the project actually functioning in Washington, D.C. So she's right now controlling her with her iPhone. That's engineer Caroline Record, who is the engineer behind the piece. But you can see how it's going to look once, you know, it lights up as you walk underneath it. So that's my next show, and it's going to be in DC starting September.
And we look forward to welcoming you to San Francisco in 2021.
Thank you.
Hopefully under an entirely new regime here in these United States. So, Rafael, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
I look forward to getting caught up in Washington.
Thank you, Rafael. This is
Montreal.
excellent.
Thank you.
And Steve, thanks again. And
Amazing.
we'll see you. We'll see you coming through the internet and hopefully in New York soon. Mick, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our next segment.
Yeah. So next segment is with RENATA, ADELA, and Paul BENNEY. And Paul I met at the Venice Biennale. I met his work, actually. I didn't meet him first. Where I walked into a chapel and I just felt, when I walked out, I was crying. And then Renata's work I was able to experience at the Royal Academy of Art's 250th anniversary show in London. And then we became friends and just incredible inspirations for me. And so our next exploration is how are artists, as they all reflect on the world in this moment of quarantine, how are they coping with it right now? What's happening with somebody? And you know, Paul was in the neo-impressionist movement in the 1980s, back in his early days, but is also one of the world-renowned sort of portrait artists, and then has his own more personal work that he'll talk about as well. So I'm super excited. This is a segment we're recording because they're in the UK. And then at the end of this, we'll jump back to overtime if Steve or Rafael have stayed. If not, we'll just sort of decide when to call this blurry day. So Omid, can you run the next segment? Paul, Renata, thank you so much for joining.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, Mickey.
Hello. So I wanted, with this whole episode, we wanted to share what artists are doing, what they're thinking, what they're having a hard time thinking about, just how these moments are affecting us. But first, let's do a little introductions. So Renata, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
Okay, so I am predominantly a sculptor, although I also work in lots of other mediums, drawing and painting and sewing and pretty much anything I can lay my hands on, really, on a good day. I explore themes that are often to do with slightly biblical, mythological, slightly to do with ritual, but mostly what I'm interested in is exploring feelings. So trying to understand or trying to express a feeling through a piece of work.
Paul, tell us who you are and a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Paul BENNEY, and I am an artist. You're talking to me in Suffolk, in England. It's about 3 hours north of London, and yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about what my work is like, I don't think, but I mean, I always find it quite difficult to actually properly translate what is essentially visual information into something that is kind of properly cogent. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'd love to be able to write it down and spend as long as I paint a picture writing about what it is I'm thinking about, but I don't do that. So, you know, it's just going to have to remain invisible on this particular occasion.
I think that's all good.
But I do have, you know, I do have a strong sense of these changes that have taken place during this time. Like you mentioned at the beginning, you know, it's like, well, how do we all react, and how have we all reacted to this, and is there anything we can take from it that might be useful in the future?
So, Renata, one of the pieces of yours that I really love is, I think it's MAPPAE. Am I getting that right? But it just seems like there are so many layers and there's so much going on. I feel like every time I look at it, I find some other little, it's almost like you've hidden little bits and pieces of different thoughts and ideas inside of there. So it feels like a wonder that I can kind of keep opening up. How did that piece come about, just as an example of sort of the way you look at things?
I think at the time there was this slight controversy about a painting that had been found, and the authenticity of it wasn't, you know, people didn't know whether it was real or not, and it was called Salvatore Mundi, and it was a picture of Christ, and Christ taking up the whole of the frame of the picture. So it's really in your face, and full frontal Christ. And I was quite inspired by that, and I made an embroidery, and I called it MAPPAE. And the idea was, mine was a shrouded figure, so you don't see the face. It's wearing a sort of top hat they wore during the plague. The figure has military epaulets. There are Platonic symbols sewn in everywhere, and it's exploring the sense of who we are as human beings. So it's the map of a human being. So it's it's death and life and nature and war and all these aspects in a sort of a figure that's right in your face.
What was the show that was a part of in London?
It was the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition.
So that was a big anniversary show, I guess, in some ways.
It was the 250th anniversary, I believe, and that was the one that Grayson Perry curated.
That was amazing, and it was just beautiful thoughts. When you started doing that embroidery, you know, did you map it all out? Did you draw it all ahead of time, or was this? I'm just curious a little bit about the craft of it, or was it as you were doing things, you came up with something you wanted to add there, or you played around? What was the process there?
Well, sometimes when I'm making something, I just have a very strong idea about the whole thing. And in this instance, that's what happened. I mean, some things were added as I was going through, but I had this strong sense of I wanted to make this sort of map. And part of the process is finding threads that are at the right color. So I could often be found on the floor of a rather well-known store called John Lewis in the haberdashery department, with 16 different types of blue and close to tears, and you know, because it's like a palette, sort of when you're painting. So I have to lay everything out like a palette, so blues and reds and whatever, and then, you know, maybe a color will tell me something that wants to be put in, you know. So there's a bit of that too, of not knowing.
You know, at the beginning of this, sort of when we suddenly realized everyone had to go into shelter, when it looked like this was wrapping around the whole world, you know, what was going through your mind?
I think, well, you know, at the time I just thought it was me thinking these things, but now several months later you realize that we've all pretty much had the same process, especially the artists and musicians that I know. And I think, and you'll be able to tell me whether it's the same for you and in your community. But I think at the beginning it was a proper panic, you know, proper feelings like there's nothing in my memory, in my information that I've had up until now that would give me any kind of guidance through this. You know, I'm going to have to think out of the box, or else I'm just going to go under, you know. And I could see that looming like a kind of giant iceberg, you know, out there, and the gloom, this sense of, you know, impending doom. And then very quickly, within a couple of weeks, from having absolutely no way of creating anything in the studio, really. Actually, the first couple of weeks were I couldn't do anything that was as a continuance from what I was doing before. It seemed like there was a kind of hiatus, and there was no. I felt like I couldn't rely on my practice in my art practice in the way that I normally would rely on it. In that it seemed like everything had somehow broken at the beginning, and including my own sense of myself, who I was as an artist, what I was doing, whether it was important or not. You know, one realizes very quickly that you relate to the world, and that relation to the world is translated into your work quite often from a very positive point of view, although you may feel, you know, alternatively glum at different times. You know, there are, you know, essentially we here in the West anyway, we have a very privileged and necessarily kind of optimistic point of view. And that was all broken suddenly, and it seemed like this could be a desperate time ahead. And after a couple of weeks of inactivity, and I sort of, well, maybe I should return to the basics of my practice in a way that I hadn't done since I was, you know, a teenager. Probably that was the last time I did any of this kind of really basic kind of craft work in the studio, going back to color theory, you know, tonal values, how to, whether I'm seeing correctly even, or whether I was just relying on stuff that I thought I knew, you know. So I questioned a lot of what I was doing, and out of that questioning I had a strong creative 2 or 3 months, I think, from that. Sort of just breaking it down, and I found myself being able to express things that I'd that I was pushing to the side or pushing down previously. But this kind of unraveling allowed me access to emotions and thoughts and feelings that had been dismissed before. So I kind of opened up a little bit more in the studio, I think.
It does feel like, you know, the quarantine, the minute we suddenly hit this moment, well, of course, it's turned into this big blur, I think, for a lot of us. You know, we call it Blur's Day. It's not quite Wednesday or Thursday or Tuesday. I don't know what day it is. It does feel like it forced us to renegotiate our position to the world in some ways. You know, it's sort of, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew what I reacted to. I thought I understood my values. And then suddenly this is happening, and it feels like each week you're challenging, okay, wait, what do I care about? Who am I? Because I think I'm a reflection of how I fit in my context. And it sounds like that happened for you as well.
Well, I think also, I mean, I think it's very true that we are, in a sense, our sense of ourselves is highly dependent on the mirror in society. But if you don't have society, you know, if you're socially distancing or you're just sheltering at home and you don't have that mirror, then it's like, oh, what am I? Who am I? You know, there's no mirror out there. There's no social mirror.
Well, you spend probably a lot more time with yourself, and you're trying to figure out who is this person you're looking at in your own mirror or something. There's it feels like.
And you can't rely on, you know, if you're feeling low, you know, just, well, let's go and see some friends, or we'll get together and everything will be fine, and it normally is. But if you don't have that chance, then you've really got to confront stuff.
Renata, what was it like for you at the beginning of the sort of the beginning of quarantine and sort of as you got to today? Like, tell me a little bit about what you feel like talking about, but in that regard, from an artist standpoint, or from a you know, being motivated, wanting to create something, not wanting to create something, whatever it was.
It was interesting. The first couple of weeks, as Paul said, it was mostly taken up by panic. The thinking about the possible outcomes and the realities of what was happening, and that really kind of took up pretty much all waking hours. Then, after about the first couple of weeks, I would wake up feeling in a way that I couldn't remember feeling since I was a child, I think. You know, when you would go on holidays, if you're lucky enough to go on family holidays, I have a memory of a few of those, and it would be the summer, and you would wake up and you would feel this sort of expansiveness, like the whole day was just this beautiful sort of energetic open vista, and there were no encroaching dark thoughts or potentials coming in. And I would wake up feeling like that. I thought, my God, this is amazing. If this is what a pandemic is, or, you know, not including all the absolute horrors that are going on, but that this is I like this. And I started to already lament the end of it, because I didn't want these feelings to go. And in the process of that too, I would set myself tasks, and I would get up and I would do some languages, you know, reading different languages and doing different things, and then going into the studio, and I would make a piece of work a week.
Wow. And is that more than normal? Is that less? Is that, give me a sense of.
Well, I mean, I can have weeks when I do that, but I wasn't expecting It was a slight surprise to me, considering how, you know, it was challenging times. So for about 2 months, this is what I was doing. And then something changed again. And partly those encroaching thoughts of, you know, the potentials, and, you know, thinking about, oh my God, look, it's amazing. There are no airplanes in the sky, and the air is so much cleaner, and people seem just more chilled out and more relaxed and maybe kinder and more. And then I started to think, it's all going to change, isn't it? Because that's what human beings do. They'll just start buying tickets to wherever they want to go to, and everybody in the sky will be full of airplanes, and the pollution will come back in. And then I'd walk into the studio, and I couldn't do anything. I just couldn't do anything. So I've sort of had the opposite of Paul in terms of, you know, I started off well, and then it sort of changed, and I've been finding it quite difficult.
Do you know the MacDowell colony? Have you heard of the MacDowell colony,
No.
artist colony?
Say
It's
more
in
about
Peterborough, New Hampshire. It's one of the East Coast's like most well-known, long-established artists colonies that you get asked to go as practicing artists to go and stay on the estate, and they provide meals and a studio and a house to live and everything. That's all the infrastructure, and you can go and finish up your novel, create an opera, you know, paint or whatever you want to do. And I was asked to go there a couple of times in the early 90s. And the similarity is very stark in this case, because for me, you know, what this isolation brought up is the same feelings I had when I stayed there, except it was voluntary. You know, I didn't have to go to MacDowell, whereas this time it was not voluntary, and I think that's why it brought up these feelings of panic at the beginning, because you just were sort of didn't know where it was going, you weren't in control of it. But essentially what I've been doing and Renata's been doing is we've been in retreat, you know, like an artist retreat, which, you know, is very normal for an artist to do or want to do. But in retreat, you know, even if you're not an artist, if you're in a meditation retreat, you know, there are things that come up during that time that can be really uncomfortable. And so during this time, there have been moments like that, but also moments of enormous clarity. I mean, that's been another very strong element to this, which is, you know, you've got days running into weeks where you're not really communicating with the outside world. So the consistency of thought, the continuing thought processes that can carry on or carry, you know, quite a few days and then result in work is very fertile, you know, it's very fertile ground. I mean, even down to playing the piano, you know, I'm a musician as well. So, you know, there are compositions that it can take, normally it takes me, you know, half an hour or something at the piano, and I've got some new little thing going. But this, you know, in this case, I can develop things over several days, and that's been a real privilege, you know. So quite apart from all of the horrors that have taken place, and that we're all familiar with, there have been these kind of remarkable moments of creative joy.
I feel like, you know, so I was thinking about interviewing both of you and what I'd want to know or what I'd want to explore a little bit. And there are probably 42 different directions. But, you know, one of the things that occurred to me was, what can people who are not artists or who don't think themselves as artists, maybe they've been all wrapped up in whatever their business is or whatever, you know, raising a family or doing other things. What can people learn from from sort of the point of view that an artist takes on the world, or what can other people learn at this moment in terms of this ability to make something? Because you're both making things. You're finding some outlet in either writing a piece of music or painting or making a new piece of sculpture. What can others learn from this? I remember having long walks with both of you and having conversations about in some ways an artist has to show up every day and invite something in. It doesn't mean that it will happen that day, but you get into this mode of being able to be open to inviting some inviting some spirit and inviting some energy in to do something. What can we learn from this? What do you think others might learn from having a point of view more of the way an artist looks at things?
I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just pushing the thoughts out of the way that are to do with what you think an artist thinks or what an artist would do, and you just don't go there, because that's not how artists think. All they're doing is they're expressing themselves. And the artists who I suppose move me the most are the artists that do that with the most sincerity. They are just expressing what it is that they're either feeling or trying to understand or trying to wade through, which is exactly what anybody is trying to do anyway. They're just doing it via that specific medium, but it doesn't really matter what the medium is. It's the act of doing that thing. And since as we go back to my brain of custard, my expression has been within nature, because when nothing makes sense to me, including even what I'm trying to do, and all sort of intellectual thoughts have long gone and left me because I just don't seem to. I don't know, lofty ideas and complex, streams of consciousness. No, I can't. And I put my hands in the soil and I plant something, or I watch a seed grow, like literally within 48 hours, and I go, what the? Really? Okay, that's extremely cool. I'm going to focus on that and some worms and some butterflies, because all the other shit makes absolutely no sense to me. But if I can get a tomato to grow, that's a good day. So,
well, I love, and you've sent pictures of the farm area you've built, and you've been kind of working out there.
To be honest, Paul physically built it. I was the farm assistant, but yes, that we make
the royal we. That
the royal we. But that's been part of my expression through this time, and I know that I'm not the only one, because where we are, for example, when this pandemic started, the thing that you couldn't find was seeds, because all the seeds on the planet had gone, because everybody was buying them to plant.
Yeah.
So there were these tens of thousands of people having the same thought, and flour and yeast, because everybody wanted to bake bread. So something has happened during this time where people who are fortunate enough to be in the position who could do this were saying, I want to grow things, and I want to bake things, and I want to make things. And these are all expressions, aren't they, of, you know, so, you know, I find that very interesting, that when everything goes shit-faced up, people want to make stuff.
If you're not an artist and you don't have a studio, you find whatever it is that's going to be an extension of yourself, whether it's bread, you know, whether it's, you know, building your garden shed, or you know, whatever it is, that's going to be your creativity, your creative act, and is no less valid than you know, somebody going into their studio and painting a painting or making a piece of music. It's exactly the same to me. It's just viewed differently.
And I think, you know, what are people trying to do in those moments? I mean, it's connection. It's some sort of connection. And when that connection, when all other connections have gone, you know, then you're compelled to find another way to connect, whether it's to literally the earth, or, you know, making something, you know, that it's things that make sense. You know, planting things make sense, growing and cooking and you know, they make sense. They involve using your hands and to a degree not really using your intellect. I mean, your brain is a sort of, you know, that sort of part of your brain is kind of slightly sidelined. It's about you know, you're in, you know, I know that when I'm in the garden, time has a very different quality, and I think also when you're in the studio, time has a very different quality, and we crave that. I think a lot of people crave that, being able to slip into that space where, you know, time is just it's just a different creature. It's a relief, you know.
Is that, you know, is the ability to slip into that, you know, that ability to go from the worries and the cares of the day to this place where you're having almost a conversation with the earth, or you're having you know, is that something that can be practiced? Is that something that we can get better at ourselves in terms of being able to slip into that place? Or what's, for either one of you, what's your sort of point of view on how we might build more capacity inside of ourselves to go out and do this, or to see,
just do it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the only way, you know. You just, as much as anyone can, just get your hands dirty.
In whatever sense that may be.
Yeah.
So Paul, I first saw your work in Venice in the Biennale, and we all got a chance to go into this cathedral, or this small chapel actually, and experience it. Can you talk about that piece? Because that to me was incredibly moving, because it was not, you know, we're talking about a particular medium like paint or something, but what I loved about that piece was you activated the whole space in a way that I felt like I walked out, you know, in tears. I walked out like feeling like, whoa, like I was just inside of someone else's head, you know, at a moment, you know.
Yeah. Well, it was about as close as you could get to being inside, not only my head, but also the 12 guys who I had painted as kind of apostles in a way. It didn't start out as a painting of the 12 apostles, but it kind of ended up like that. They all appear on the painting in a kind of frieze across. It's a very large painting, about 4 meters by 3 meters, and with a kind of flame appearing above their heads. Now, that all might sound a little bit cheesy, but I think in this context and the way it was presented in the chapel and the way that I painted it, turned it into something else. Now, that painting isn't the entire installation. This installation also involved 6 other paintings that were on different altars, or hung above different altars around this chapel.
So these are the bell jars around the...
And they were candles, paintings of candles within bell jars, but they were all alight at different stages of their life as candles. So burning down. But of course, as you know, within a bell jar, you can't light a candle for longer than a second or two, because it just goes out. So these were kind of strange kind of visual dichotomies that were still as paintings, as in that they weren't moving, but people still thought that they were video images, which I found very interesting. That they couldn't see these as paintings. And then maybe that's something to do with the very glossy, shiny resin surface that I applied to all of them, which kind of looked like a screen. But also I think there was something about the drama of the place as well that made people think that they were kind of like these little movies going on. And in fact, the big painting of the 12, I was standing there one time when a little kid came in and asked her mom and said, Mommy, I think the video stopped.
Well, but what I think was amazing was there was also, if you just stood in just the right place, it felt like you were tuning inside of them.
And I climbed the stairs and I saw my father. And he used to be 6'6", and he was hunched, green, like a tiny shell in bed. And I knew he was dead. And I thought, if I go downstairs and don't say my father is dead.
As an added level of, or an added kind of way to appreciate the work, there were 12 monologues that I recorded from all of these men who were all friends of mine, but they agreed very bravely, each one of them, to relate a moment in their lives that completely transformed them. And it could be, a birth of one of their children, or, a very strange drug-induced experience, or some life and death moment. And they were all, they all arrived at the studio at separate times, and in the dark generally would talk about these moments in their lives. Now, all 12 of them were recorded, and then I showed. They were projected into the chapel through a series of speakers that had only just really been invented, that focused sound into a spot in space, which was about a meter square, like in a ball. And if you walked into that meter square ball of sound, the focusing would actually focus the sound within your skull. So it sounded like a voice inside your. In fact, it was a voice.
It was a voice inside your skull.
And it sounded like you were being talked to by some higher being. People were very unnerved by that.
It was very powerful. Renata, what are you working on right now? What are you or thinking about in terms of making? And it could be whatever, but just sort of what's on your mind?
I have a few things on the go. I have a painting that I'm doing. Can't really tell you about it because then I'd have to kill you.
It's okay.
Don't want to do that. Then I'm sort of making a version of La Pietà, the very famous sculpture. Not at all similar. And I've also been doing, or have been doing, a lot of drawing, because I find that often when things get rather complicated, what I want to do is I want to just have a piece of paper and a pencil and take it all right back. You know, so there's nothing else to think about. No colors, no paint, no thread, no, you know, complex materials. But just a piece, just a pencil, and then it sort of helps or sort of organize my brain. It's actually I think it's quite brave, and it's also extremely simple. And I think maybe that's why one feels that there's a sort of a truth to it, especially when you just need to move away from everything else that requires much more of much more brain power and resources or whatever, organization, and you just, for whatever reason, you just can't or don't want to do that thing. You just go back to the pencil and paper, and it's almost a sort of a regrouping, you know.
Thanks so much for spending time. I kept you far longer than I thought, but I appreciate it. And
yeah, it was good. Good
Thank
to
you
see
so
you.
much, Mickey. It's wonderful to see you.
Well, hello, Mickey, and we can also invite Rafa back. I think Rafael's still with us.
Hi.
Thanks, Tris.
Can you hear me?
Paul Benny Akin.
Hello?
All right. While we're waiting, okay, by the way, this happens, Rafa, every time we go into after time, which is right around this, about 5:30, Mickey's internet crashes. So this is nothing new. But I had a question for you. We were chatting kind of in the back channel on this. Artists, we were talking about the Long Now, which is this wonderful organization in San Francisco that takes kind of a long view of things. And Danny Hillis, who's a great computer scientist, wrote a piece for them that talked about how we were going from the age of the Enlightenment to the age of the entanglement. The Enlightenment, the scientific era, all had laws, it had certainty, we predicted stuff. Today, in a world that's all interconnected in dynamic systems, small inputs bring big outputs. That's why complexity science is so significant. You could argue that a lot of people's difficult response to the pandemic is kind of the inability to both process the scientific method and the fact that there's unpredictability. And your work seems to deal a lot with that. That was the title of your San Francisco show. And Mickey and I often talk about the fact that the cultural world probably doesn't help people understand this field that so much is driving our natural world today. And I'm wondering if that's something you think about, and if art today is trying to deal with these issues.
I have an artwork called Entanglement, and it's a super simple piece. And of course, it's a complete bastardization of the actual phenomenon of entanglement. But let me explain what the piece is real quick. It's two neons. They both say the word entanglement. And when you acquire the piece, you get both copies. And what we do is we have a little computer that is connected to each one of the neons. And you put one at your sister's place or at your mom's place and one at your home. And then when you flick the switch on to turn your copy on, it automatically sends an email to the second copy, which also turns on. So they're both on or they're both off. And I sold this to a collector who has a twin sister. He's in New York City. She's in Birmingham, England. And she gets home after work, switches on the neon sign, and it turns it on in New York as well. So for me, this kind of absurd, but, sort of little tunnel connection between these two entangled pairs is, of course, a metaphor of intimacy, of complicity, of connectivity, of being mindful of somebody else in the other side.
Yeah,
that piece was about 15 years ago, but it's for me as a Latino, I guess, as a stereotypical romantic, entanglement is one of these phenomena that it's proven experimentally, but we still don't begin to understand how two electron pairs that are separated by miles and miles can actually communicate with each other faster than the speed of light. And so I'm super excited about ideas of science like that.
Yeah, Raphael, I love this because I think actually a number of our episodes we've talked about this shift to the entanglement, the shift to kind of appreciating complexity, complex systems, the work Santa Fe Institute and others have done, but also this notion that, if you actually study how humans create and actually how most of nature works, it's quantum. Yeah. And we've only had the first wave of quantum computing, with GPS and things like that. And now we're entering this second wave. And it's that notion of, between a bit and a byte, Vannevar Bush and others kind of perspective on this versus Babbage, as you cited, and Lady Ada, his programmer, Lord Byron's daughter, which ties into processing.org, which we talked about at the beginning of this. It's that notion that it's not a bit or a byte. It's not a flipped coin that's either a 1 or a 0. It's like spinning a coin and having all the infinite possibilities between 1 and 0, and then slapping it and then collapsing the answer. And it's that notion of searching a very large, high-dimensional quantum space in a moment. And of course, we've now seen that photosynthesis is quantum. There's a whole branch now of quantum neurology and quantum biology that's looking at the effects of that. Nature's had 3 billion years of an R&D lab to experiment with every damn lever it can. And it turns out that entanglement is a very powerful lever and a powerful thing, but it's nonsensical. And I think humans love this idea that we can understand things. And obviously Richard Feynman tried pretty hard with his Feynman diagrams to help a generation understand quantum. But Einstein went to his death pissed off at Niels Bohr and quantum, and the series of articles and diary notes and letters back and forth between him and Schrödinger and others, highlight the annoying part that it might be that the universe is not something that a human brain could wrap around, but it's so exciting to try to get there. Yeah, to pursue this quest. I have understanding that so much more of us are entangled. That the act of observing us changes us. The act of engaging your piece changes the piece. We can't look at the speed and the location of a photon or something. So it's a very exciting kind of moment where we're shifting from top down and very much, sort of trying to analytically understand it, and shifting to emergence and shifting to really algorithms and algorithmically, emergent systems. What books are you reading, Raphael? I'm just curious about how do you find inspiration?
And I also want to get your response to kind of how the artistic world is responding to what Mickey just brought up, right? This mind shift in physics and in understanding, because the art world has a role here, because if things aren't logically understandable, they must be emotionally dealt with. And I think this is why the art world may have an important opportunity here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to mention that, I have a chemistry background, so I studied science in my bachelor's degree. And I've long felt that the art world or the humanities in general have an extremely simplistic 19th century idea of what science is all about. They're thinking about this kind of utilitarian positivist approach, which is just exactly not what science is today, right? Science, as you were mentioning, Mickey, is a site of intensely uncertain and eccentric behaviors. I don't claim to understand them because I actually forgot most of my science. It's kind of sad. The other day I found my thesis and I just couldn't believe I wrote that. But the reality is that it still inspires me. Like my very, very first catalog for the Venice Biennale was called Some Things Happen More Often Than All of the Time. And this I just extracted from an article in New Scientist about just how eccentric this world can be, and then how that can inform, at least metaphorically, our understanding of social dynamics. I wanted to say that a big inspiration for me is irreversibility, right? So Prigogine, and just sort of being being at ease with this kind of uncertainty and the irreversibility of complex systems, it was best described by one thing, which I think is the absolutely most interesting explanation of life and death. And stop me if you've heard this before, but it's that idea that apparently they were investigating two cells, one alive and one dead. And they were basically analytically showing that these two cells were identical, like chemically and electrically and in terms of compounds and composition. These cells, if you were to look at them, the living and the dead, were identical. And then with Prigoghine's thought, the idea is that, of course, the living one is in relation to its neighbors. So there is a snapshot does not tell you what life is. A snapshot just paralyzes all the systems of fluidity and electricity and flow that happen in it. And I've always thought that that's applicable to art too. You know, oftentimes we want to own an object or own a fossil or own some kind of snapshot, but the snapshot doesn't tell you the real story of complexity, of emergence, of behavior, of surprise. And that's why I think media art is so great, is because media art is always becoming something else. Not all media art, but all good media art. The idea that the artwork can take a role that you did not anticipate for it is one of the humbling and also exciting parts of it. And finally, that the work is out of control. So that's a really key thing, because in consideration to the history of modern art and the idea of this search for objectivity and universality, we are so now much more interested in the idea of specificities and eccentricities and this kind of singularities that can happen with this kind of complex systems and that are not designed top down. They emerge from those math.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, this not designed from top down. It seems like in complexity science, you know, I ran a design science lab for a long time that did quite a lot of work around complexity at Carnegie Mellon, out of Carnegie Mellon. And one of the things we noticed was that one of the most successful methods of approaching complex systems was meet in the middle. And meet in the middle meant that you wanted to have a theory and then do a whole bunch of empirics and then change your theory based on the empirics. And so you'd have like bottom-up emergence, you know, peer-to-peer and things like that. If you cut your leg, it does not call the cloud up here to fix your leg. You die. The whole species would die. It turns out memory is so cheap in nature that you can put a copy of you in every cell, and it's massively peer-to-peer. It starts building scaffolding and things. But then there's a layer of complexity, you know, called the endocrine system, and then the nervous system, and the circulatory system. And so it's not actually all peer-to-peer. It's not all centralized. It's actually some meet in the middle effort. And and most of the really great, I think, theorists, but also the people who get stuff done in the world with complex systems, understand that we have to have this kind of feedback loop between theory and you know, empirics, I guess. I wanted to mention the book I'm reading that I think you'll really appreciate. I just got it. It was recommended to me recently. It's called This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution, David Sloan Wilson. And he really tries to go beyond what Darwin talked about in terms of you know, species and individuals, but he tries to actually look at how communities are formed. Why are we actually altruistic? Why did that turn out to be an evolutionary value? And why do we cooperate? Why do we collaborate? Why are we xenophilic, where we need strangers? Like, we feel isolated if we're not there, versus many of the apes and others, aside from the bonobos, are xenophobic. You know, they'll kill somebody who comes into their territory. Bonobos won't, and humans won't. And so it's a very fascinating exploration. And that leads me to my question for you. We always like to ask, you know, what are you reading, watching, consuming that has nothing to do with you or your work, but that is inspiring you, that is kind of getting you to take your brain off your work and explore something different? What's come up in your sort of radar?
Well, I'm reading a lot of finally with COVID, picked up reading again. I'm not proud of saying this, but I used to read feverishly. I have 3 kids and I'm a workaholic, so I'm always working. But I've started reading again fiction because I've always found that just immersing yourself in somebody else's stories and narratives is amazingly creative and amazingly catalytic for stealing ideas or whatever you need to do. I just read, for example, I'm just reading finally Roberto Bolaño, which is criminal in my case. Bolaño, as you may know, is so important for Latin America in general, but the fact that he wrote about Mexican poetry and Mexican feminicide and stuff like that. So I just read the Detective Salvaje.
Died sort of too soon as well. And I think Carlos Ruiz Zafón just passed away, unfortunately, as well, who wrote some stunning sort of magical realism about the Spanish Civil Wars and that era. Which book are you reading of Robert Bolaño's?
I finished
or is it more
the Savage Detectives, and I felt that that was amazing. I mean, I come from I don't come from a literary background. My parents were nightclub owners, but my dad's cousin was Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz Lozano is a Mexican poet, and forever, for me, the poetry. Here's the thing about poetry that I think you might like. What Paz was saying is that poetry is a compression algorithm. That ambiguity is a capability for an interpretation to be sort of condensed into a very economic vehicle that could be read in a plethora of ways. And I just love that idea that indeed,
great idea.
Poetry is just so effective in being able to become itself like some kind of hologram of so many other realities. So yeah, I grew up with that kind of background. The Bolaño that I'm reading now, I'm halfway through, is 2666. And and that
was a hard one to read. I mean, it's dense.
It's dense, but it's also very different.
But it's wonderful.
Like 5 books or something. And then I read a lot of. It's kind of stupid. I'm reading a lot about management. I run a studio with 15 people, and nobody teaches you how to manage, how to survive, how to make budgets, how to think creatively about supporting operations. And so I'm like doing all this, kind of crash course in like fundamentals. Like you would not believe what an idiot I have been with this kind of planning. And problems that I have are so common in the industry.
Can I ask a question about that kind of enterprise you have? You have a studio.
Garcia?
I was going to just ask a question. Studio, and you're an artist. Are you funded by commissions? Do you do research? You have an amazingly capable artistic engineering team at your disposal. And is it driven by major commissions, or is it driven by exploration? Like how does that enterprise work?
So we have, I love to talk about this stuff. So we do 50% of our income comes from galleries, collections, commissions to an extent, and 50% comes from what we call performances. So exhibitions, son et lumière, spectacles, festivals, so live stuff. And it's 50-50. It's changing a little bit more because now we're getting more and more commissions, and those tend to have like a bigger footprint or a bigger profile. The other thing that we're doing at my studio is we're in Canada, and in Canada they have this beautifully civilized support system for R&D. So a big chunk of the salary that I do pay my employees is actually supported by the Canadian government, because there was basically a brain drain of people leaving Canada going to the US, and they said, no, we need the Canadian companies to be able to afford paying good salaries. So I'm in fact an R&D firm here in Montreal, and we get like subsidies up to like 50% of people's salaries. So that's super, super helpful. And then another
Rafael,
thing,
at some point, we might want to talk, since I ran a design lab, Maya.com, for 13 or 14 years, and we balanced between funding from the NSF, from DARPA, from others, where it was actually, we were rewarded for investing in research. And then also we did work for hire. And over 30 years, we learned the balance. We ended up spinning out many companies from it because we wanted tech transfer from research. It's not an easy thing. I never want to do it again. I think being the CEO of a consultancy is something you might want to try once in a while, but it's a role you should play. And then please find somebody who loves doing it, and then get back to what your real passions are.
Yeah.
I had a question. I don't know if you've read Gods of Shade and Shadow, or Jade and Shadow, by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Wonderful new author coming up in sort of maybe magical realism. I'm a big fan of that, but it's set in Mexico. And her new one, Mexican Gothic, is actually just starting to hit the charts and actually broke the top 10 in New York Times, which she was shocked by because she's actually written for a long time. But I think you'll appreciate Gods of Jade and Shadow. It's sort of, it's got an Aztec, Mayan history, but also, ghost story kind of into the future. And quite,
awesome.
There's been a really amazing resurgence of Latino authors across science fiction and magical realism, obviously, as well as the mainstream.
Hey, Mickey, do you know what it is now?
What's
it's 5:55 Pacific Quarantine. So we're heading to the 6 o'clock hour. We may want to wrap, but I'd love to ask a question of you. Earlier on, Rafa, we were talking about the importance of the public sphere and connection, particularly at a time of isolation. And we were also mentioning that when we go back out, because like we haven't been out, we've been at home lately, there's an opportunity to either relearn or reboot or make sure we get it culturally right, because we're in a world where this is a really easy time for the Chinese or the US or anyone to deploy surveillance. And the opposite of that would be deploying some form of public connection and art, which I don't think we think about intentionally, but it sure be an intentional act. So I'm wondering if you could take us out and perhaps give us a guide or a spec or what we ought to be thinking about. Perhaps if you were the god of public art, or you were invested with Robert Moses's capacity but better intent, what you might do.
Because we know you're humble. If you were God for a day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Public art.
Yeah. So for someone who goes out of his way to say that I don't like messianic people, here I go.
That's great.
Here are my 10 commandments. No.
You're in your zone.
I don't have that many commandments, but what I do know is that that public space is in crisis, that certain things are really problematic, like the most important one, of course, being that public becomes private, and that a shopping mall has a code of conduct that, by law is actually defensible, that you have insistence on surveillance, for example, and tracking and metrics as a way to make us safer, when what we know, for example, to actually protect us from a terrorist attack, what you need is some good old diplomacy and translation, and some sort of truth and reconciliation over colonial systems and slavery, and some redistribution of wealth. And I don't mean it in a communist way. I don't mean that. I mean like just taxes, people pay their taxes. There shouldn't be this enormous amount of companies getting away with not paying them. And so I have a feeling that, why did I talk about taxes? I forget how that relates to public art. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that I have a feeling that we're in a crisis right now of representation. Churchill once said, we make buildings and buildings make us. But the contemporary situation suggests that that's not the case anymore. Buildings do not represent citizens anymore. They represent capital. They represent what is the most effective, most optimized way to generate a building. And so a new building in Singapore, Mexico, Montreal, or San Francisco is bound to be this default building that responds only to like optimization of capital. And I'm not complaining about that. I'm saying how can we as artists reintroduce eccentricity? How can we interrupt the narratives of homogenization, of globalization, and create this massively public, connective spaces that invite you, I was going to say force you, but invite you to speak to somebody who you would never speak to. I think this kind of civic, solidary, connective tissue is the work of our time. I feel like there's a dehumanization, a dehumanization, and we just need to re-embody and rehumanize. Actually, no, not humanize. Sorry, because I have a problem with humanization, because of course that's what's wrecking the planet. Anyway, that's for another call. We could talk about that. But we
have an upcoming episode actually in August about transition design, which is about how do you get stakeholders like plants and animals and other parts of the ecosystem to be a part of this? How do we move away from human design to actually trying to foster those ecosystems with the former head of the school? Pardon?
Do you know Marilyn Warren? She was
no, we don't. I mean,
she was a member of parliament for New Zealand, I think in the 1980s, and she crossed lines from one party to another. She's famous for a documentary called Who's Counting, and it's a very sort of like practical approach of saying, what is the value of clean air? What is the value? She puts a value on how the GDP goes up when Exxon Valdez, just poisons the shores, because that brings GDP up. So what she does is this: she does this kind of very holistic approach to give value to things like drinking water, and her whole system of economics is great, because if we could charge gas or gasoline or whatever, we could surtax it for the cost of the cleanup. Things would work out. I don't think that people want to, in their good mind, poison themselves. I think that they just need to know we need to work.
But it's often a time frame problem. The quarterly. I want to strongly recommend that you find one of Mariana Mazzucato's talks about the value of it. She relitigates why it is that the NSF and research and taxpayers spend 40 years paying for something that then Kleiner Perkins at the end says we were the risk takers and takes all the credit for. And it's really about relitigating the value of everything, and how do you collapse this sort of bifurcation that's happened where 6 people have the same equivalent value as half of the planet's population today. And she's an economist at UCL in London. I think you would be blown away by that. And it sounds like it relates to Marilyn Warren. Hey, Omid, can you pull up our whiteboard for a second? Are we sharing that? Is that live? So by the way, I've been doodling the whole time you've been talking in a pretty half-baked way because we have an infinite whiteboard for every episode. Here's Art Infects Infrastructure. A little bit of the conversation around how Danny Rosen's Wooden Marrow shifted to pareidolia, the difference engine, and Churchill and Orwell, realm switching, and ultimately poetry as a compression algorithm. I also tried to capture, obviously, Paul and Renata with Salvatore Mundi and some of the work going on there. So we're slowly getting to the point of saying how might we co-create together. But it turns out that whenever we're around, every episode is actually captured since the very beginning. That's season 2, and then back to season 1, where we've really tried to capture the conversation. This is quantum biology with Andrew Hessel and Steve Jurvetson, and a whole bunch of different things. So I think you gave us the perfect way to go out. Let's go back to just Rafael. I love your idea of public spaces are in a sense under attack, and that we need to get out and we need participation, and we need to find any way we can to actually re-engage and also think about the value that we care about.
We did a show.
So that was pretty good. You weren't trying to be messianic. I thought that was.
Yes, thank you. Look, more for Messianic, good Messianic. We did a show a couple weeks ago on if one were to conceive of a World's Fair or a model space or in this era, it would be bottom up, co-created, emergent, everyone would have a role, and it would be solving for different kinds of things, different kinds of connection issues than we had before. So we're going to revisit that again, but we'd love to invite you into that conversation because
please do.
That's a great thing.
I can go here in Montreal. We've got Buckminster Fuller's American Pavilion from Expo 67. It's just such a beautiful site to talk about that kind of thing. I think is one of the
Is
most.
that giant dome still up from 1967?
Still there.
Yeah.
And there was actually City of Montreal was putting out requests to see what should we do with it. And of course, I know exactly what we should do with it, which is to clad it again, like Buckminster Fuller wanted, but this time with fire retarding, sort of materials as opposed to it getting burned down. And then creating a massive game, the World Game, because now Buckminster Fuller was so ahead of his time that World Game, now we can do it and we have to do it. And I would love to tell you about this project I have called Population Theater. We want to create, so you know how the new Raspberry Pis cost $5 and they can give you 4K. So the $5 ones give you HD. But anyway, so if you have 3,651 of these Raspberry Pis and you put them together, you could create a display that is 7.7 billion pixels. And what's interesting about this population theater is that you could use it for statistical, sort of drama jockeys to represent statistics, but not as a graph, not as an abstraction. Because once you show, for example, migration or gender or any of these things, one of those little dots, and your mom and your cousin are one of those little dots of light. So it's a one-to-one display. It would cost me $2 million to do. And if you... any backers, I would love to.
Do you have a paper or a link?
I do. If you go on my website, lozano-hemmer.com, there is a video about population theater and explains what it is and how we would accomplish it for not too much money.
I recently in the fall I talked to the former chairman of the board of Buckminster Fuller Institute, and he's actually really interested in rebooting the game, the game that Buckminster Fuller came up with, because he actually believes that like sort of a massive multiplayer game could actually do this. Just your instigation on this could fit really well with what Peter's been thinking about in terms of how might we shift a World's Fair from being about.
On your site, is this under projects or videos? Where do I go?
Projects.
And what's it called?
Population Theater.
Got it.
Guys, it's a real
reminds me a little bit of Charles and Ray.
I can't wait to share wine together.
Yes, we will get together virtually.
I think you should call it, Peter.
And here, folks, it is now 6:07 Pacific Quarantime. Have a wonderful weekend, and we're back next week. Thank you, Raphael, Steve, Oneed, Jocelyn, and everybody.
Thank you, Raphael.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, don't tell me.
Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance, quarantine. Now we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.